Order. Can I thank you for coming along this morning? This is the first evidence session or inquiry into sanctions. We've got a lot to get through before Parliament prorogues for the general election, and this is obviously a wide-ranging and important inquiry. We've got two panels and rather a lot of witnesses this morning, so I hope you all feel that you get a chance to have your say, but I will be moving things along so we can keep to time if that's possible. But can I begin by beginning with you, Philip, if you can introduce yourselves for the record.
Yeah, my name's Philip Connolly. I'm the Policy and Communications Manager for Disability Rights UK.
Paul Farmer, Chief Executive of the mental health charity Mind.
I'm Kirsty McHugh, I'm Chief Executive of the Employment Related Services Association, and we are the representative body of the employment support sector.
Matthew Oakley, author of the independent review that provoked or preempted this investigation and inquiry.
And I'm Tony Wilson. I'm the Director of Policy at the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion.
Well, thank you very much, and you're all very welcome. And as I say, we've got a lot of questions, but if I can start, as you said, Matthew, that you have done the initial independent review, but which was limited in its scope and perhaps didn't cover everything that we would want to cover, which is part of the reason for our inquiry. But your review was published 4 months late. It was published on the day that the House rose for the summer recess. Why was that?
So the first thing I'd like to say to that is that I really appreciated the work that the department did with me on the review. That I found everyone from Job Centre Plus advisors to policymakers all the way through to ministers really, really helpful, supportive of the work I was doing, and allowed me to undertake the review in a completely independent and impartial manner. So I just wanted to put that on the record. In terms of timescales, the review was tasked with reporting back on the period that covered a year following the passing of the Act, which I believe finished on the 31st of March, was that right? I can't, sometime around then. There was a certain amount of uncertainty around the actual what that meant in practice. So what we decided as the team, between me and the team of officials working with me, that we would use the data that was published, I believe in March, which was covering up to the December period. So we really waited for that data to come out to make sure that the results were as timely as possible and covered most of the period of that year-long period. That took a certain amount of redrafting and re-editing of the report to ensure that the results were consistent with what that data said. I think the key thing to say, there was nothing sinister, certainly on my part, that I experienced, and partly I think a reflection of the timescale was my changing of jobs and limited time to actually redraft and make sure that I was happy with the results and what I was saying.
So you're saying that the delay was from your side rather than from the government side?
There was two things. One that we needed to wait until that data had been published, and that took a certain amount of redrafting. And secondly, that I wanted to make sure that the report was completely watertight. As you all are aware and appreciate, it's a very contentious and important area, so I wanted to make sure that the drafting was right. So really just the report sat with me for a little bit whilst I did that.
You said that you came to conclusions independently. Were you not constrained by the terms of reference of your report? That would you have liked to have gone further and wider?
No, of course I was constrained by the terms of reference. The terms of reference were the terms of reference, and I was working within those. I think it's important to say that an awful lot of work went into even just looking at the assessing the system in terms of that terms of reference. There was a lot of work to do, and so a broader report would have taken an awful lot longer and taken an awful lot more resource and time. It's also, I think, important to say that communication and understanding is hugely important in the sanction system. Without that, no system in the world would be fair or efficient or effective. And so, really, I do think that communication and understanding and the terms of reference, or the remit of the review, were hugely important and should have been set as they were. That said, and as my review does conclude and talk about, there are, of course, wider issues that should and could be considered around sanctioning. I would hope that would be undertaken as a matter of course by the department and by you in terms of your scrutiny role. And of course, I would support any kind of further work in this area because I think it's hugely important to get it right.
Yeah. The government has variously said at different times that it's accepted all your recommendations, will be accepting or has accepted some of your recommendations, or will look at others. What is the position with regard to what the government has already put into place with regard to your recommendations, and what do they still need to do that they said they would do and haven't done?
So I probably know about as much about this as you do, and that I'm now an outsider, and I don't routinely monitor what the department are doing, and certainly in the detail that's needed to assess the full extent of whether they're putting in place these measures. What I have seen on the positive side, there is now a guide on the gov.uk website, which was created, I think, whilst the review was being undertaken, which explains job seekers allowance sanctions and the process for appeals, for reconsideration and hardship payments. I think that's a really positive step forward. The one place I would push there is that if you go onto the gov.uk website and search for benefit sanctions, that doesn't come up in the search page for quite a while. But it is prominently displayed in the job seekers allowance pages, but not if you search on the website. So I'd push the department to do more there perhaps, and also to extend that guide to cover hearsay sanctions and other sanctions which are possible. In terms of the other recommendations, I've seen, and I'm sure you all have seen, the update that the department published in December. That focused a lot on the communication side of things. I'm waiting for more, basically. The one thing I would say, and I think is really important to consider, is it would be very hard to pick up progress in a lot of these areas without seeing more evidence and more evaluation. I'd be very keen that the department continue to invest in evaluation and proper data collection, ensuring that they're testing whether claimants are understanding the requirements that are placed on them, whether if they're sanctioned they understand why, and then if they are in place of being sanctioned, that they understand how they can take the next steps in terms of appeal, reconsideration and claiming hardship payments.
So you're summing up of the government's responses. They've accepted some, but there's work to be done on others.
I mean, I think there's of course work to be done. Some of the recommendations, were clearly not meant to be, couldn't be implemented immediately. Some will take renegotiation of contracts. I'm sure that Kirsty can talk about that. Others will take time in Parliament, either primary or secondary legislation. And I think it's right that they take time to get those issues right straight away. That said, there are other issues that could be addressed much more quickly. The housing benefit issue, I don't know whether that's been addressed effectively or not. But
that's going to be. I'll let you finish, but that's going to be our next question. Was there anything else that's obvious? No. Okay. No. I'll go on to that question then from Brenda Jackson.
Thank you, Chair. It is the issue of housing benefit, or rather sanctioned claimants' housing benefit being inappropriately stopped. And in response to concerns, the government has said that it will, where necessary, there's a question in there in itself, tell claimants to inform their local authority that they have been sanctioned. Dr. David Webster has said that this is clearly not a reliable solution. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. And I think what my review and the government's response outlined, that there should be an intermediate measure which was ensuring that claimants knew to contact the local authority. But in the medium to longer term, that should be a system which is clearly done by the government. Frankly, the legislation sets out when and where and when and how people should be sanctioned. And if they're being sanctioned incorrectly or their housing benefit removed because of that incorrectly, that's the fault of the government, and they should be taking action to make sure that doesn't happen. As I understand it, and I can only comment on what was published shortly before Christmas in the DWP update, that seemed to imply that there was an IT solution that was already in place. I don't know the details of that, but perhaps that would be more appropriate for someone from the local authority to answer.
Well, on that issue of IT, do you think that would be a solution to the problem?
My understanding of the problem is that it was caused by local authorities not having enough information or misapplying the rules because the information that was sent through from DWP that was unclear. So I think an IT solution could solve that adequately, yes.
Can I just, was that because what the local authorities were being told is their entitlement to GSA had stopped, and therefore the housing benefit was stopped rather than effectively had been suspended because of a sanction? And it was just that
I think
explanation was missing.
A lack of clarity with that, yes, and a lack of clarity with how that information was applied. A lack of consistency with how that information was applied.
Could I just ask any of you, I mean, I find very curious the government's response where necessary to tell claimants. I can't think of an area where it would not be necessary. Anybody got any, like to tighten up on that? It is clearly a responsibility, you would say, that DWP should be informing local authorities.
Sounds sensible to me.
Yep. Thank you very much. Your review, Mr. Oakley, recommended that the government pilot pre-sanction written warnings and non-financial sanctions, both of which the government says it accepts in principle. I think this is to everybody, not just you, Mr. Oakley. Do you support the introduction of pre-sanction written warnings?
Can I kick off?
Fire away.
So the review recommended that this was piloted for a relatively limited amount of people. For those people who are moving on to the work programme who had spent up to a year on Job Centre Plus but who had not been sanctioned in that time. Yeah. So they've clearly been complying with the rules and regulations and understanding what they needed to do. If then they are sanctioned as soon as they hit the work programme, that does to me certainly indicate that perhaps there's a lack of understanding about what the requirements on them are being, and that should really flag and signal a lack of understanding rather than a deliberate act of non-compliance with the regulations that have been set. So that was really where I was looking to focus attention. The idea is not a new one. It was mentioned in the Freud report in 2007-8. It was mentioned in the Paul Gregg review in 2008 as well. So really just thinking about how we can improve understanding and make sure that when we are sanctioning people, when the government is sanctioning people, it's because they've willfully not complied with the regulations rather than just simply misunderstood what's going on.
And, I mean, the government has said that pre-written explanations before sanctions would require legislative change. Do you agree with that? I find it curious an MP to be asking you that.
Yes, I'd imagine that's almost certainly true. I wouldn't see that as being a significant barrier to change, given the level of pilots and tests and small changes to legislation which are coming through the House and also through secondary legislation quite regularly. So I certainly wouldn't see that being a insurmountable barrier to change.
And that would be across the board, would it? Because obviously there are certain categories of claimants for whom they will need specific explanations of what the sanctions are about, either because of mental health difficulties, learning difficulties. Across the board, is this going to cover those kind of specific, most vulnerable cases, do you think?
What I would say is I think it should be piloted first, and then learning from that, it should be rolled out as and when appropriate. I wouldn't want to see this rolled out across the system without proper testing and proper evaluation to see what the impacts would be.
And would you argue for the proper testing, proper evaluation to begin with the most vulnerable claimants? For example, the two categories that I've just
I don't see why that wouldn't be the case, given that's potentially the most risky people involved.
And what kind
can
of...
I just ask,
sorry.
Tony, you were trying to say something earlier.
Thank you, Sharon. Just a brief point. I mean, to some extent, I think that this is happening already, actually. There are some examples, to some extent, there's some examples that we've heard of in local authorities for people with chaotic lives, people who are vulnerably housed or rough sleepers, for example, where Job Centre Plus advisors are contacting the caseworker and the local authority caseworker, where somebody fails to attend an interview or a meeting to try to resolve issues before a sanction has to be applied. And that in itself is a form of kind of early warning or early engagement or more effective and intelligent use of the system. So I don't think it follows actually that primary legislation would be needed just to be more sensible and intelligent in how we apply the existing rules. Having said that, I think it would be better if it were enshrined in primary legislation. I think actually there's 3 or 4 of Matthew's recommendations which would require primary. I think this is a very good opportunity, and this inquiry is a good opportunity to make the case for a new act or amendments to the existing act in the next Parliament, which could help, which could address some of these issues without turning this into a free-for-all, entirely discretionary system, but one that has better and more intelligent use of early warnings, of earlier engagement and joint working.
And Paul, did you indicate?
Yes, well, just to follow up on the point, really, I think we would certainly support for those people who experience particularly serious mental health problems, a kind of a cushion, if you like, or a place where people could have the situation very clearly explained to them, and so that they can fully understand the situation that they find themselves in. And I think one of the great challenges of the system as it currently is at the moment is particularly applies to those people who are on ESA, who are often, and then, obviously this was beyond the original scope of of Matthew's report, where I think the kind of overall levels of communication and understanding actually kind of undermine the broader issue of the application of the system. So I think we would support both the kind of common sense approach that says that you need to have good quality communication across those people who are working with those individuals, but I think we'd also support the enshrining of that in legislation so that you can have a much more systematic approach so that people feel reassured that there is a process that applies to them before a sanction is applied.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Sheila in and then I'll come back to you.
I mean, I take the point that there may be a need for legislative change, primary or secondary, given the terms of the 2012 Act and the clauses in that relating to this. But it sounds almost like a sort of chicken and egg situation, that you want legislation to be, or any changes to be worked out well, and the best way of doing that is to do pilots, and there seems to be some hesitation that you can't even do a pilot unless you've changed the legislation. I mean, surely it's open to government to pilot something with a view to getting better legislation. But we understand the reservation here.
I completely agree. I mean, I'd imagine it would, for instance, be relatively easy to pilot this through universal credit, where there's there's a great deal of flexibility actually within the legislation, so it could potentially, I'd imagine, go through secondary rather than primary, but I'm not the expert, but I'd imagine that could be the case.
Presumably, if there was this pre-sanction written warnings, that it would take away an awful lot of the uncertainty and the anxiety and the confusion that claimants are feeling at the moment, which is what we've got in terms of a lot of the personal testimonies we've got. The system is they just don't know why they've been sanctioned and they don't understand it, and to have something which is written and they can refer to, or they can take to someone else who can interpret it for them.
I do agree with that. I think where I would pause slightly is that, and as the review highlighted, the vast majority of people who are claiming job seekers allowance particularly aren't sanctioned. And so we wouldn't, all of us, I don't think, would want to put in place a system which undermines the conditions which people are already complying with and already undertaking with full knowledge of what they're expected to do to try and tackle a problem elsewhere. So what I would really suggest is that this is targeted on people where we can identify clearly that they have been complying with the rules as demonstrated by being on job seekers allowance and not being sanctioned, and then there's a change in behaviour which means that they are sanctioned out of the blue when there's been a change. And I think that clearly then identifies a group of people who might be struggling with understanding rather than just, and the review did speak to people who just said, actually, I felt like staying in bed today. And we wouldn't want that then to say to them, actually, you're free to do that for once, because we'll give you a written warning. We need to make sure that the system is maintained as a strong and effective conditionality regime.
I think Paul was wanting to come in.
Thank you. I think I've read your report, Mr. Oakley, about 10 times now. I'm still struggling with one particular paragraph in terms of what it's trying to tell me. There's a part where you refer to the fact that of a group of those job seekers allowance applicants, about 28% have been sanctioned. But when you consulted the DWP's figures, only 11% had been sanctioned. I've been trying to get my head around what that is trying to tell me and what point you were seeking to make by including that information. what lay behind that particular figure? What factors are coming into play?
So if I remember correctly, that's referring to a DWP piece of research a few years back. And what was really just trying to say that there was an overall level of confusion around the sanction system. Some people, when asked about their benefit experiences, say they've been sanctioned, when in fact they haven't been sanctioned, they've just had a benefit level change because of a change of circumstance, or because they've entered work even, that they might be earning a certain amount of money, and that means that the benefit award has been reduced, and they regard that as a sanction. So really just, and similarly other people who have been sanctioned don't say they've been sanctioned, so it's the other way around. So really just to say that the whole system is quite misunderstood by claimants, and even the word, from the review and the people we spoke to, even the word sanction can be quite confusing to claimants who it's not necessarily something which they would understand on a day-to-day basis and what that actually means.
Would it be fair to therefore say that perhaps the word sanctions has grown in terms of its meaning to the welfare community, as it were, i.e. academics and beyond, greater than its actual application within the system? For example, I've met people who have had a benefit suspension, which is arguably more draconian than a sanction, yet say they have been sanctioned. Is there a need to focus down the debate onto actually what a sanction actually is, rather than use it as a catch-all term for many of the other problems in the system, including the actual work capability assessment itself?
No, I'd agree with that. I think that's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're using language effectively, but also then on DWP to make sure it's communicating effectively with claimants who either could be at risk at sanction or disallowance or suspension, and understanding what those circumstances are and how they can avoid that.
I just have one final quick one. A lot of your report is about communication, the clarity of communication. You refer to the Litchfield Review's phrasing on organisational justice and the fact that people have to be seen to be treated fairly within the system. A lot of what Mr. Litchfield's most recent review was focusing on was communicating adverse decisions. Do you think there is greater scope for the department to learn from what Mr. Litchfield is saying in terms of adverse work capability assessment decisions, to apply that to where sanctions are occurring? For example, the focus that goes on communicating the adverse decision verbally rather than in writing, soliciting good reason verbally before communicating an adverse decision. Do you think that there's sufficient alignment between how the department is viewing adverse decisions from the likes of the work capability assessment with sanctions? Do you think sanctions are almost the poor relation in terms of communicating bad news to welfare recipients?
I mean, I think there is, as with the work capability assessment and conversations, it is obviously a very difficult conversation to be having often in person, that you are going to be sanctioned. And I know that advisors we spoke to said that there was mixed views about how well that would go down in a job centre, for instance, and certainly worries about abuse and or physical violence in job centres. That said, the review review did recommend that the department should ordinarily be recording claimants' preferred route of communication. It's a recommendation that the Social Security Advisory Committee also made recently, and that the department should be using that preferred route of communication to let people know that they're at risk of a sanction and that they have been sanctioned if and when that happens. That could be through text message, letter, phone, email, in person, depending on what the claimant desires. And that for me is the key. It's around personalisation and making sure that we have a system which meets the needs of claimants in terms of their communication preferences.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
And I think you've got another quick question.
It was about what you've just said, the personalisation of this information, because certainly, and again this is anecdotal, it's exclusively in my own constituency in the main, people see different decision makers. They endlessly have to go through this process of explaining things over and over again, because the individual is not their individual, if you see what I mean, as far as the decision makers are concerned. And I can't see any way around that. I can't see that the government is suddenly going to flood Job Centre Plus with additional people or earmark that. So is there any way that there can be some system put in place where the individual decision maker has all the facts, even though they may not have seen that. They may be seeing that claimant for the first time. I see lots of nodding heads. Jump in if you've got some response to that.
The sharing of information between different parts of the system is really, really important and doesn't work anywhere near as well enough. You know, we've got the situation with the WCA still not being shared with the outsourced providers.
Yeah.
So, for instance, somebody is in the RAG group. They've been referred to the work programme. There hasn't been sufficient explanation of what the work programme is going to entail for them. And the work programme provider hasn't got the WCA. And then that individual doesn't engage, for whatever reason it might be. It might be actually they've been put into the RAG group incorrectly. It might be there's been a deterioration of their condition, or maybe they just simply don't understand. And then the frontline advisor, they've got no engagement with that individual. They're not playing ball. What do? And because the information isn't shared, that means it's far more likely to potentially end up with raising a sanction doubt.
Exactly.
And that's not in anybody's interest at all. That can't be the right way. And if we were able to share information more successfully across different parts of the system, we would avoid some of that, I think.
Thank you.
Philip,
Yeah, thank you, Anne. We have members in welfare rights organisations reporting this problem to us. And they said the information within DWP is spread over a number of computer systems. They mentioned JSAPS, MSRS, and LMS. LMS is the only one I'm actually familiar with myself. I mean, that's local management system. But with Universal Credit too, we're obviously going to get a new computer system. And what data is going to get transferred, we don't know. So I think there is a real issue here about the data that people source from to make internal decisions is spread over many systems.
Thank you.
Debbie, sorry.
My question's to Mr. Oakley. You said in your earlier remarks to the Chair that you thought it was a matter of course that DWP would undertake further investigation. I wonder, I appreciate it wasn't within the scope of your original inquiry, but in terms of whether you felt, if you had a personal view on the appropriateness of some of the sanctioning that's being undertaken.
That's a difficult question. Just in terms of the keeping under review, I think that's the same across all government departments, that every policy should be kept under review and should be reviewed in terms of the effect it's having. The one thing, and drawing on evidence that came in from the review, a number of people commented on the extent of changes in the sanctioning system in the last two parliaments. Certainly since the Paul Gregg review in 2008, there has been quite a sizable escalation in the severity of the level of sanctions. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a full investigation or a full evaluation of the impacts that's had. So that's what I would be suggesting we go forward and have a stock take of where we've got to, the effect it's having and the impact it's having on both movements into work, agreement with the system, whether people support the system, and the kind of fairness and impacts more broadly.
Thank you for that. Were you surprised that the department have resisted this? The ministers have resisted doing a more broad. I mean, we've undertaken to do this inquiry, which will also be fairly narrow because of the time availability and so on. But the department has resisted, and ministers have resisted doing a wider investigation into the effect of sanctions on all claimants.
I'm not aware of those discussions particularly, but I certainly from having from experience in DWP, I'm sure there are evaluations ongoing. So.
The final point is in terms of your own view. It wasn't within the scope of your inquiry, but in terms of the efficacy of sanctions in their key task, which is to get people back into work. What do you think? How effective do you think that they are in getting people back into work?
My knowledge of the academic literature suggests that the conditionality system as a whole is a key element of ensuring that people are doing as much as they can to take up the support that's available from the state, and that's been shown across international experience. There's there's issues with, as I just said, about the changes that have happened in the last 10 years and whether that is continuing to be the case. But certainly, at a principled level, the existence of a conditionality regime which is backed up by sanctions, there are very few people who would argue that shouldn't be in place in a fair and effective welfare system.
But can you say that there's a causal relationship between sanctions and getting people into work?
I believe that's what the academic literature says. Yes. Just a quick prod at DWP that if we had more information about movements into work rather than flows off benefit, that would be much easier to actually evaluate.
Exactly. I think Tony was
kind of pick up on that final point, because I think the key point is one you make about the link between sanctions and movements into employment. Because I very much agree with Matt, and I think there's a lot of evidence that looking at the benefit conditions, employment support, and the threat of and the inevitable existence of sanctions as a consequence for not engaging in support and not meeting conditions as a system is more effective than the alternatives. And this has been shown internationally. We talked about some of the evidence in our submission. Very good, robust evaluations of evaluations, big studies internationally, which have concluded that is the most or one of the most effective models. And it's also, I think, quite clear from what successive governments have done here, the New Deal actually probably being the best example of a series of increasing support, increasing requirements and the threat of sanction. However, and that includes actually employment impacts as well as benefit impacts, is there evidence that sanctions of themselves, being sanctioned, leads to movement into work? The evidence is far from clear-cut, it's far from clear. There's some evidence that it may increase the likelihood of entering employment, but it often appears to be poorer quality employment, temporary employment, unstable employment. There's very clear offsetting negative impacts which may likely outweigh any small marginal positive impacts, and those positive impacts aren't felt by all groups. So I think actually there isn't evidence that sanctions themselves should be an objective if you're trying to increase employment. I would argue that sanctions themselves are a failure. Something has gone wrong when a sanction is applied. Either the individual has not met their responsibilities, the state, the institutions haven't successfully communicated those or enabled those to happen, or the system hasn't worked, if you like. An ideal system actually would have very few sanctions being applied rather than very many, but it would have very strong compliance with the system, engagement with the right conditions, and the right support. And I do feel like we end up looking at this the wrong way round. Kind of a rising trend of sanctions does not mean a better system. I mean, actually, if I were in the government's shoes, I would be very deeply concerned about this and wanting to understand how we can get those sanction numbers back down. And just also on the point about evidence, I mean, this is a bit of in terms of the severity point that Matthew makes, I think that's really key. This is an evidence-free zone, really, about whether increasing the severity of sanctions of itself has any positive or negative impact. We just don't know. It's never been tested. And I do find it, whether or not they have an independent review or not, it's quite striking that the government has not commissioned evaluation of this. I mean, this is one of the most important reforms that the government has introduced in this space in the last 5 years. And they're evaluating universal credit, evaluated the work programme, evaluated local housing allowance reforms, evaluated the social sector size criteria, evaluated really everything, as they should, the benefit cap, as they should, but not evaluated sanctions. Regardless of whether you have a review or not, let's evaluate it. Let's do the research, understand what impact it's having.
I'd agree with you. Just for the record, though, that there is emerging evidence of a direct correlation between sanctions and the impact on claimants leaving JSA, not for the purpose of work. So I think that's a really worrying trend. So people are just going, what happens to them?
That would be consistent again with the evidence. And I've talked more about some of the qualitative research we've done in local areas, which has shown up quite different impacts for different groups as well.
I think, Kirsty, you were trying to get
very, very briefly, from the provider point of view, so absolute agreement with Matt and Tony over here. We think the evidence base needs to be increased. I think generally the providers believe that there is a role for sanctions to be part of the toolbox, but they should be a last resort, really, because that is when things have gone very badly wrong, and nobody wants to put people into that situation. I think there's something which needs to be looked at around the impact more on the more vulnerable job seekers, which you've identified as a committee. But also there are people out there who have been repeatedly sanctioned, and there doesn't seem to be having any impact. And so what's happening there? Is it because they are living very chaotic lives and they're vulnerable? Are they working? You know, there could be a whole host of different things, and actually that needs to be looked at as well.
Okay, I've got Graham and then Paul.
Just on that point I was going to raise, because the evidence of the people that you represent, and also to Tony, is that when sanctions were threatened or imposed, these people did disappear because they were working in black economy and were also claiming benefits. And once the sanctions were put in place, they disappeared off the register, not necessarily into paid employment that we would all wish them to do, but disappeared wherever they came from. So a lot of people did come off the register in my constituency because of that.
Yeah.
Is that typical in your example of your members?
I don't think there's a sufficient evidence base, if I'm honest. One of my members did out of their own pocket, sort of commissioned an external agency to go and knock on doors of the X number of people who had been referred to them who had not been participating at all. This was the work programme provider. And there's a proportion who just do not participate. And regardless of the methods of communication, there hadn't been any ability to get them into the office or whatever else is going on. And of course, this is the sort of person who is likely to be referred for a sanctioned out. So they employed a company. It was young women. Went along, knocked on the door to find out what was going on. About 200 houses from memory. Some of them probably were working. A lot of them, though, more of them, wrong addresses. It was wrong information. So they went along, thought these people were there, and they just weren't there at all. And there was some elements of ill health, but the biggest issue was about information flows not being correct.
And just specifically on your project that you referred to in your evidence, it does state that there were some people who were found to be already working. Doesn't give any figures at all. Clearly 200 is quite a small sample indeed. Size. I have heard an ample amount of anecdotal evidence that there is an element of those who are being sanctioned who are working in the black economy and come off benefit because they cannot combine working in the black economy with the new conditionality of the claimant commitment. Are you or Mr. Wolfson aware of any more detailed research on the interaction between the black economy and the sanctions regime, or whether any research is being planned? Because it's a tempting avenue to go down for politicians to say, oh, they're all working in the black economy, but there does clearly need to be some evidence base to assess the size of that, if there is any at all.
No is the answer. No, I'm not aware of that research, or of any research having been commissioned or been done. But by its nature, it'd be very hard. So if you go back about a decade to the last sort of research around looking at the impacts of sanctions CVP did, I think from memory about a third of the people who were contacted, who they tried to contact, who'd been sanctioned, they simply couldn't reach. And of the 2/3 they did, very few, if any, I suspect actually not any of them would have been in the black economy. They would be in that minority. So I don't think it's typical necessarily that this would be the sort of these would be the characteristics of people being sanctioned. But similarly, we pick up in anecdotal, not usually, in fact never to my knowledge, by interviewing somebody who has worked in the black economy and been sanctioned. But usually you pick this up through engagement with Job Centre Plus staff, with local authority staff, and so on. Be really worth. I think it's an area that's really worth looking at and trying to do proper research on. It'd be very, very hard, I think, actually, to do that research to find those people.
Can I have one quick one more to Kirsty? Sorry, just further to Kirsty. We had evidence from the Catholic Social Action Network, CSAN, about examples in Liverpool of the charity Nugent Care, where people who had been referred to the work programme and were contesting that decision to place them in the RAG were not going on to JSA as was being recommended, but rather were making applications to the Liverpool Crisis Fund because they felt they couldn't meet the conditionality requirements of going on to JSA. That's clearly one example in Liverpool. Is that something you are familiar with elsewhere in the country, that those who are contesting their work capability assessment outcome are not going on to JSA and are therefore not getting the same amount of money they could do because of that conditionality aspect?
I think that is happening. I think we gave in our evidence, the feedback we'd had from members in terms of why there has been an increase in ESA sanctions. And one of the big issues which is coming through are people who have been put into RAG and they're contesting that decision, or they could have been put into fit for work. They could have been sort of put onto JSA, and again they're contesting that decision, and that leads to a set of behaviours, which doesn't mean that they're getting the support that they need actually.
So if they are rejecting their placement in the RAG group, therefore they are less likely to want to engage anyway in the conditionality aspects of that.
Yes.
So therefore, in a sense, the problem isn't so much the sanctions regime, it's the inadequacy once again of the work capability assessment to correctly assign these individuals.
When you're talking about people who are on or who have been on ESA, it's very difficult to look at sanctions without looking at the WCA.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got some questions coming up on that particularly, but Philip, you're trying to get in.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to mention two things. First of all, in response to what the MP, Debbie said, there is evidence I've become aware of through hosting a seminar just before Christmas with economists, and the evidence that was presented at this seminar, which I think members are aware of from David Stuckler, is that people are coming off benefits but not actually going into work, so that there's a lot of uncertainty as to what actually is happening to those people.
Yeah,
it's
one of our recommendations in more than one report is that the offload does not give the evidence it has. So,
and I think
we're well aware of that.
And I think it's worth also exploring not whether these people are working in the black economy, but whether they're being financially supported by other people. And I think we shouldn't be moving to an automatic assumption that somehow these people are in work.
I think point though, the 200 people that this thing was done. I mean, what we talk about is fraud, potentially fraud and error. So the data is error. Yeah, well, fine. I said fraud and error. But the point is that if you go and ask for benefits, if you go to a bank, for example, you have to provide your address and so on and so forth to open an account. So to get your benefits, then there's an awful lot of work. What you're saying is an awful lot of work that if you're a recipient of benefits, then you really do need to prove that what your name and address is and so on and so forth. Whereas a lot of people are getting paid benefits, but clearly, based on what you've said, and our own anecdotal evidence is that they're getting paid benefits, but their actual address is false or wrong.
Or wrong. It could just be a legitimate sort of mistake within the system.
I'm going to move on a second. I think if you just hold on a second, I think Paul, you were trying to say something, and then we're going to move on to the I think Anne-Marie's going to come in, and then we're going to move on to ESA. As I say,
just very briefly, because to reiterate a point made earlier, that we absolutely see conditionality and sanctions as a last resort, and it particularly applies to people with mental health problems. And just kind of adding into the conversation, there's some really interesting and helpful guidance around the use and application of what's called a core visit, and we're not aware of core visits being applied at all in terms of really trying to understand what is happening what might be happening to individuals who are at risk of potentially at risk of a sanction. And so perhaps you might want to ask the DWP how that guidance is being used, because we're certainly not aware of that being used.
Yeah, that's fine. That was going to be one of our questions. Anne-Marie, I think you've got very quickly, or
ease into the vulnerable group question, which I know Sheila's going to be asking. With regard to communication, Matthew's already talked about effectively two types. You've got the stuff you have to pull from the web, and about the inadequacy, although there haven't been some reviews, the inadequacy of what's there in terms of how you search. But the other part of it is clearly the individual communication with the individual claimant. And while you said we should move to something which includes a personalised option, text messaging, emails, etc., I guess I have a particular question for Mr. Connolly and Mr. Farmer. When you've got individuals with mental health or other disability problems, one, is there something the government could do short term before we get to the personalisation, because that will take time, when an advisor actually knows people have these problems, which will make the communication work better? And are there particular concerns you have about the plethora of communication options available, that they don't quite include things which are going to work for your particular groups?
Well, perhaps I could say something first. I've been dealing with this issue for 8 years in a way. DWP have a system of mass communication to a mass audience, and are not really in a position to make exception. Well, however, there are legal obligations on them to make those exceptions and to communicate with people in accessible formats, for example, people who are blind or partially sighted. And this doesn't happen as a standard practice. There ought to be a provision so that on the data systems when they first interview claimants, they can capture what their access requirements are and any other issues that are going to interfere with the ability to communicate with this person. And this particularly applies obviously to people with learning difficulties, but also people with mental health conditions, and may find it very difficult to engage with brown envelopes with windows in them. And I have said repeatedly to DWP, if people are not responding to communication, maybe we need to find another way of communicating with them, or somebody that they're happy to receive the communication on their behalf. And so I think there's a massive issue about how DWP communicates generally, and its failure even to meet its own legal obligations.
And there are clearly two dimensions to this, aren't there? There's the way in which written communication is delivered and choices of access to receive that written communication. I'm not sure I would want to receive a text message telling people with mental health problems tell us they wouldn't want to receive a text message telling them they're being sanctioned. That doesn't feel terribly appropriate. But there's also the interaction between individual advisors across the system and people on a human level. And I think in both cases, people with mental health problems tell us that it isn't the level of expertise and knowledge and understanding isn't sufficient to really get those messages right. And we appreciate the complexity and the difficulty of delivering a high volume set of communications. But Mr. Collins is absolutely right that for many people, the fear of what lies behind that envelope, is extremely stressful, anxiety inducing, and has to be handled incredibly sensitively and carefully, and too often people tell us it doesn't feel like that for them.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Sheila's question.
Yeah. As Kirsty in particular first, I think the ERSA evidence was suggesting that sanctions would be most appropriate where the non-engagement was, I think the words were motivational or behavioural. Could you explain that a bit further, and to what proportion of claimants do you think that applies?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it. Relationship works that you're more likely to get somebody into work if you've got a good relationship between the advisor and the job seeker, fundamentally. And what all my members will tell me is once you've got somebody saying, I can work and I want to work, then it's almost a job done. Because it's about getting somebody's mindset into the right place. And often if people have been on incapacity benefit, ESA for an extended period, they've been told you're too ill to work. Work isn't for anything, isn't for you. And therefore it can take quite a long time to actually sort of challenge that in a supportive way to get people to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. Now, is a sanction going to help people along this route? Probably not in the majority of cases. However, if there are individuals who, really just do not want to engage at all, they've been referred to the work programme or indeed another programme. What do you do? And they're not engaging. Do you just leave them? Well, then the provider could be accused of parking that individual, and performance levels go down, etc. So it's that sort of the individual who's not engaging at all that maybe that's where a sanction doubt could be raised. That said, there's this issue about vulnerability. If somebody isn't engaging, it could be because there was a mental health difficulty, as Paul says. The WCA hasn't been shared with the provider, that may not be visible. And therefore it's about the communication and the sharing of information with Job Centre Plus and potentially other parts of the system as well, to ascertain whether there's anything else going on with that person, which means that they're not actually complying with a programme they've been mandated to in many cases.
Is there the opportunity or the resource within your members to make that distinction and find that out? You've said it would be helpful if the WC was shared, and
yes.
I think we said that in the last report as well. And
I know,
still isn't happening. But when the work programme was set up, I remember being taken on a visit to the provider in my area, and there was a lot of things said about how there would be the opportunity to look in depth into people's problems and so on. Is that happening, and what kind of tools are used to, at the beginning, when people are first referred, to work out if they do have some of these problems that you described?
All providers will carry out an assessment of need. And that could be a sort of psychosocial behavioural type approach. It could be something which is more focused on employability, depending on what that job seeker is presenting with, and the quality of information which has come across from Job Centre Plus. But what my members tell me is it often takes a number of meetings to actually get under the skin of what's going on with that individual. For instance, there could be drug and alcohol issues which are often not acknowledged, even to the individual. There's often mental health difficulties which could be combined with something else. So for people on ESA, it's often not just one problem, there's often two. It could be musculoskeletal and there's depression, for instance. And that can take a little while to actually ascertain what's going on. And then from there, you can put in place a support package. Now, if you've got somebody who is just not engaging, they're not turning up, or maybe they've turned up once and then they're not responding, then you can't do that. And that's the sort of individual, particularly if they're, there's been a deterioration in, or for whatever reason, that's the sort of individual where a sanctioned doubt, I think, is more likely to be raised, but they could be vulnerable. And so I think there were concerns about how we identify the vulnerable within the system. And bear in mind as well that actually the DWP will come along and sit with providers, and if they think that individuals should have been sanctioned, and they haven't been, they will say, why haven't you done this? So there's that element going on as well.
Do you... From that perspective, the accusation or the assertion has been that increasing numbers of people, because more people on ESA and the RAG are going into the work programme, and policy seems to be that there are an increasing number of people being sanctioned. Yet the performance as yet for this group in terms of getting people into work is quite low. So the assertion sort of you're more likely to be sanctioned than you are to get a job. I mean, are you concerned about that? And what steps are you taking to
the ESA performance is the biggest concern out there, and we've got to get it right for the next round of contracts, because frankly there is not enough money in the system to meet the needs of people on ESA. There just isn't. Tony will back me up in relation to that, our independent expert at the end. However, we can't just wait until the next round of contracts. We've got to see what we can do now. And so we said it's about health money, it's skills money, but that's really difficult to actually knit together around the individuals. We think that the number of people starting ESA at the moment is about 12%. And that's not the job outcome figure, that's lower, but obviously there's a time lag in relation to that. But we do know that once somebody started work on ESA, they're likely to stay in work, the sustainment levels are high, because they've made that mental leap, and they want to work. We think the increase in ESA sanctions is to do, as you said, the increase in number of people coming through on ESA, so there's a correlation in relation to that. There has been an increased focus on performance. Everyone wants to see performance going up. That might be leading to more sanction doubts being raised. But I think then there's issues around the work capability assessment, people being referred to RAG and therefore the work programme who shouldn't be. Secondly, they could be, once they're in RAG, spending their time contesting that decision, actually rather than engaging with the programme. Because their mindset is, I've got to get back onto my higher benefit because I'm too ill to work. And all those things have a particular impact in relation to this as well.
I was going to ask the panel, if I may. We know that in the last, I think it was 2012 to 2013, there was a 250% increase in sanctioned of ESA claimants. And I think Matthew's report indicated that 90% of sanctions originated from work programme providers. Do we know what percentage of ESA claimants that are sanctioned originate from work programme providers?
The sanction doubts being raised. I don't know that offhand. That should be available though, should it not, from the DWP?
Yeah, I don't know the figure.
But it has suddenly increased.
But of course, the number of people coming through on ESA has really radically increased as well over that period. We had very few coming through of ESA to begin with. So that's not the whole picture, but it is part of the picture.
I mean, there is a more worrying point about this, the huge growth in ESA sanctions more generally. I think providers are doing what DWP require them to do, and referring people where they're, this is government policy rather than providers' action on their own behalf, off their own backs, to refer people sanction, but the sheer growth in it, when this is an area again where there is no evidence, in fact the evidence suggests that conditionality generally for ESA claimants hasn't worked actually in the past. There isn't any evidence about a positive impact from work-focused interviews, nor indeed from pathways to work, nor indeed from so far from the work programme. That evidence will become available as we improve our evidence base, as we test more things, as we do more work. But the fact that sanctions are running so far ahead, frankly, of any understanding of what works and developing an effective model of conditions and support for people on ESA, I think is deeply worrying. We've said in our evidence, well, I think it's got to the point where we should suspend the application of sanctions for people on ESA until we actually have a much clearer idea of what the journey and the support looks like, what works in terms of conditions and support, and the impact of sanctions.
I wondered if Philip and Paul wanted to comment on this. Particularly, I think there was a report from Salford at the weekend in terms of how ESA sanctioning was actually exacerbating the ill health of people already on ESA.
I mean, I think as we said in our submission to our evidence, we think this is a kind of symptom of a much deeper problem about ESA, and I think other witnesses are also emphasising some really fundamental challenges about the nature and the structure of ESA for people, and just to try to paint that picture a little bit more. So people telling us, that in terms of their engagement, there's a lack of understanding, mutual understanding. So a quote from somebody who gave a submission to our report we published last year. Advisors had little knowledge about mental health, and when I asked to see the specialist they had, it became apparent that she knew little more than the others. There was no apparent sympathy or understanding with my background. Some job centre staff were harsh, threatening and unsympathetic. It made me tearful. Secondly, a fear of sanctions. So during my time, again another quote from our report, during my time on the work programme I was hospitalised due to an overdose, but because I was so petrified they wouldn't believe me or that the information would get lost and I would get sanctioned, I turned up to my appointment a couple of days later anyway. So there's an underlying impact on the kind of psychological well-being of many people who are on ESA at the moment. And then you add into that this really extremely concerning high level of application of sanctions for people on the ESA, up from $1,700 a month to $4,800 a month, and people with mental health problems being disproportionately affected in the terms of sanction application. There really is quite a fundamental problem here, and of course the great shame about this is that people with mental health problems have got one of the highest want to work rates of any disability group, and Kirsty's right. If you can get that information and the engagement right, then you can support, and we've got some good, hopefully we'll have time to come on to this, we've got some really good examples of programmes that are running in a conditionality free space where the success rate is 4 to 5 times higher than the success rate of the work programme approaches.
Is there any regional breakdown on these cases?
On
the escalation of sanctions?
Yes.
Regionally, we've got that.
Yes.
You've got that.
I think I'd like to say that I think what we need to do is to sort of go to a relationship of trust as a relationship of fear. A relationship of trust between the government and the claimant, and where the claimant is confident that they're going to get the support that's tailored and personalised that's going to make a difference to their job prospects. There are many aspects of that support which currently people aren't getting. So, for example, peer-to-peer support. They contact sometimes with an individual job coach who's with a high level of intelligence about the local labour market conditions. There are many types of support they're not getting. The support that's currently on offer is too small, too generic. It's around job searching or CV writing. It's support they've frequently had before that's maybe not made a difference to their prospects in the past. And then they're faced with sanctions. More people are being sanctioned than are actually getting jobs, as has been said. And so I think we need to re-engineer that relationship of trust, because as other people have said around the table, we want you to see a climate where those people who want to work actually feel confident that the support's going to make a difference to their prospects, and we'll definitely see outcomes from that.
Some of the guidance that the DWP has for JCP staff on paper sounds good. And for example, one I was going to highlight was the guidance stating that where appropriate, a member of the DWP visiting team will visit ESA claimants in their home where the claimant has a mental health condition or learning difficulty and has failed to attend an interview or participate in a prescribed activity. And I'm sure you would support that as but in your experience, does that happen? Have you experienced that?
There are relatively good guidelines around safeguarding, but it's our experience that these are not being adhered to. And also these guidelines are increasingly being treated as just merely guidance. It has no legal status anyway. And so we're actually seeing it being increasingly ignored. And so, for example, those 60% of people on the ESA have a mental health condition or a condition that's going to affect their cognition, only in 8% of cases are actually GPs being contacted with the ESA 113 form to seek the further medical evidence to be able to take into consideration what decisions should be made with regard to whether they should be sanctioned or not. So there's lots and lots of aspects where the guidance is increasingly being ignored, and I think that's to the detriment of everybody in the system.
It's really unclear whether the guidance is always not being used, and I think we would really welcome some greater clarity around that. I'd agree with Philip that guidance is pretty good actually. If it was really applied more regularly, I think it would really help plug some of those information gaps that Kirsty was talking about, and the ability to try to really give the providers the best possible chance of supporting the individual, I think could be very helpful. But where it's very unclear, and we are not hearing of any examples of people receiving things like a call visit, for example.
I'm going to go to Paul now, and then I'm coming to Teresa for question 12, and then that will be this session finished. Okay.
Mr. Farmer, you made some interesting comments about the mental health, people with a mental health condition and the sanctions regime. So I'm just trying to get you to a conclusion, lost conclusion of what you're saying. If the sanctions regime is operating on a risk and reward philosophy, i.e. people will do something because the alternative is far worse, is that appropriate for those with a mental health condition? I would suggest no, it isn't. You've issued a report, I think it's called We've Got Work to Do, where I think you alluded to this, where you've had a much better success rate. Can you talk a bit about how conditionality features, if at all, in those models? And if we were to go to the logical conclusion of all of that, that people with a mental health condition need to have some separate regime in terms of sanctions and conditionality, would you have any concerns that that might be a stigmatising separation, or would that actually be a positive development?
Sure. That's a
bundle
of questions. Let me try.
And you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. let me just try and unpack that as briefly as I can. I'm conscious of time. I think first of all, the overall the evidence is telling us very clearly that the current approach for supporting people with mental health problems who want to find work isn't working, particularly for those people on ESA. I think actually the situation on JSA is a little bit more mixed and a bit more debatable, but certainly on ESA it really isn't working. The report we published, and we'd be very happy to give members copies of the report if that would be helpful, looked at a number of schemes using the individual placement and support model, which I think is a very well evidence-based approach. These schemes are currently run in this country. They're normally run by voluntary organisations. They're funded normally either by the Mental Health Trust or by the local authority, sitting on the side of supporting people with serious mental health problems. They are totally conditionality free programmes. They are locally based programmes. So, and the evidence suggests that they're pretty effective. They're delivering 20 to 25% success rate in terms of supporting people back into work. So pretty successful. And they're mainly working with people with who are in secondary mental health services. So they're working with people with by definition, with quite serious mental health problems. Now, I think our contestation has always been that the construction of the current programme is that it is both generic and national in its structure. whereas the evidence base, as it applies to people with mental health problems, tells us that a more local and more specific programme would be more effective in supporting people with mental health problems to go back to work. I think the challenge that faces the DWP in a future contracting arrangement is how much can those local initiatives be scaled up, and how local can the DWP go in terms of its commissioning approach. So our report advocates taking people with mental health problems who are currently on ESA out of the current process, which would include taking them out of the current conditionality process. I should be clear, we're not totally opposed to conditionality. We've made that point. But we think that if you're trying to understand how you support people who experience severe depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, particularly thinking perhaps about those people who have experienced the state, the instrument of the role of the state in applying compulsory treatment to them under the Mental Health Act. So compulsion in this context, as applied to somebody, has wider connotations for people, and this is what many people tell us. Then we believe that there is a better kind of gain, both for the individual, for the providers, and also crucially for the taxpayer, in terms of helping and supporting people into work. So yes, we would argue that that's the case. Now we understand that there are some potential risks around kind of creating a separate scheme, and I accept the point you make about stigma, and we of course are lead kind of partners in the Time to Change campaign, which is all about tackling stigma. And there's a strong argument for saying that as integrated a programme as possible is applied. I think that we should have to look at the end goal here. Mm-hmm. The end goal surely has to be supporting people with mental health problems who are not currently in work and want to work, to find them work as quickly as possible. That is the best way to eradicate stigma in its broadest sense. And we're beginning to see positively many more employers recognising the benefit of supporting the mental health of their employees. And we think that the climate is beginning to change and make that more conducive. And it's almost this, the barrier, the inconvenient truth of the current programme is that it wasn't designed for people with mental health problems, and as a result of that, it isn't working for people with mental health problems.
Can I just add one thing? I think that Paul's just missed one important point, which I think is about the amount of money in the system as well. Yeah. It doesn't matter whether you have one system or one programme or two programmes. Mm-hmm. If you have a separate local programme and it's not properly funded, and it's all payment by results, you're going to have the same problems that we have now. Actually, so we've got to bear that in mind as well.
Right, I'm coming to the last question that Teresa got, and then we'll finish the session.
Your submission strongly supported one of our recommendations in our JCP report, which was that conditionality should be balanced out with in-depth advice and support from the JCP, so that it should be a contract on both sides. Yeah. Do you think Job Centre Plus does that?
I think in many cases, yes, it does. Where it can, and I think it does actually. In particular, where people are becoming long-term unemployed or have particular barriers to work, people with longer durations, for example, and many young people actually, will usually have a named advisor and they'll provide employment support. I think, however, things have changed quite a lot, even in the last year or 2 years, in people's perceptions of the role of Job Centre Plus, and I think actually in the role that Job Centre Plus is playing. And what we hear again and again in kind of in-depth qualitative research in local areas and with residents affected by welfare changes and so on is a feeling that they're not getting access to employment support, and the Job Centre Plus essentially is trying to catch them out, to find reasons to suspend payment. So
it's like the old-fashioned unemployment benefits office rather than...
Exactly. And I think and that's actually leads on to a second point, that I think there's an increasing risk that we're starting to see a separation, if you like. I mean, the rationale for creating Job Centre Plus was to bring together benefits administration and employment support in the same place. So the conditions for receipt of benefit, the BA function, sat alongside the LDF, Employment Service Benefits Agency. The employment service function of employment support sat alongside that, and that worked as a sort of integrated system. And we know that was independently evaluated. We know Job Centre Plus was very effective in that. What we do here, and I think we are seeing, is some separation of that now. Much more focus on compliance with benefit terms, suspension of payments where there are doubts about a change of circumstance, even things like suspension of payments. One case study that we've that came up in our research was an ESA claimant who became entitled to personal independence payment, failed to notify Job Centre Plus that they were why should they even be expected to, but failed to notify Job Centre Plus they were now receiving that other DWP benefit, had their payments suspended until it was determined whether there was any impact on their benefit receipt. And these sorts of stories, and you hear, and similarly you find with couple formation and separation and so on, are deeply concerning and point to quite a different, I think, relationship. And that has inevitably, I think, run alongside generally a reduction in the number of advisors, and particularly specialist advisors, to provide that more work coach, personal advisor type role. I do think one of the really big points we've not talked about today, but I think is really important, is the impact of that. It comes back to Philip's point about building a relationship of trust. For people who aren't required to attend Job Centre Plus, they now do not go to job. They do not volunteer for support because they see this system as being punitive and as being harsh and trying to catch them out, as it were. So lone parents with younger children, so people with health conditions, non-working partners, people on low incomes, where they want to get employment support, they don't go to Job Centre Plus because they're worried it will lead to conditionality, sanction, a query about their benefit receipt and so on. And there isn't, and the loss of other local support systems essentially means that those people are falling through cracks. And I think it's deeply worrying. I think we've now got a growing number of people actually who are outside mandatory employment programmes, mandatory support, but don't really have anywhere to go to if they want to get help to find work. And I do think that points to, I think, trying to rebalance that role for Job Centre Plus.
So the sanctions regime could be putting people off who don't qualify for any money but have an underlying entitlement from actually seeking the support.
The sanctions regime, I would go as far as to say the sanctions regime is putting people off who are not required to attend Job Centre Plus because they fear that if they do attend Job Centre Plus, it will lead to doubts being raised about their entitlement, it will lead to them being reassessed and so on. Whether those are perceptions or whether that's because of people's perceptions of what will happen or reality of what's happening, I think is another matter. I think a lot of it is because of their social norms, if you like, that people, they see what happens to people around them and are fearful of it. But this has come up again and again in different parts of the country and different research that we've done. It's come up with enough frequency that I think we can say it's happening with some certainty. And that, related to that, actually, people who become sanctioned are then also pushed away from employment support. If you've got a 6-month sanction, where do you go if you want to get help to find work? Because the last place you're going to go is back to Job Centre Plus. I think we risk actually creating a group of people who are outside really any form of employment support.
And on that note, can I thank you very much for coming along this morning. We've got through a lot, but there's plenty more we could have been asking you. But for the time being, can I say thanks? And can I ask you to move out very quickly so we can get our second panel in? Can I extend a welcome to our second panel this morning? We've got a lot to get through with a lot of witnesses, so thank you very much for coming along this morning. But can I ask you if you can introduce yourself for the record?
Okay. My name is Keith Driver. I'm Policy Manager at Citizens Advice Fund.
My name is Pete Dwyer. I'm Prof of Social Policy, University of York, and I lead an ESRC funded project on welfare conditionality, sanction support and behaviour change.
Hello, I'm Nikki Hart. I'm a project coordinator for Blackpool Food Partnership and I work for Methodist Action North West.
My name is Chris Mould. I'm the chairman of the Trussell Trust, which runs the largest national food bank network in the UK.
And my name is David Webster. I'm an honorary senior research fellow at Glasgow University.
Yeah, and as I say, you're welcome this morning. The first set of questions, I think, has come from Dream.
Questions on the current system. The claimant commitment is designed to further intensify job search requirements under universal credit. DWP will be able to require some claimants to spend 35 hours per week looking for work. It's a full-time job, looking for a full-time job, as it were. So is there any need for Job Centre Plus to prescribe specific actions by using job seekers' directions? Peter?
I think for me one of the key issues in relation to universal credit is the fact that we, for the first time, got an extension of requirements in relation to conditional requirements and now being applied to people who are in low-paid work. So it's not just about those who are inactive in the paid labour market, but the conditionality threshold that's written into that piece of legislation can say to people who are on in-work benefits on low-paid jobs that they may have to look for another job, look for a better paid job in relation to a receipt of universal credit, or be subject to sanction and fine. So that, for me, is a major step change, I think, in the way in which conditionality is being applied. And commitments, claimant commitments, in a way, are about the balance of the relationship between the so-called advisor and the client or claimant of welfare. And I think the problem with them is that essentially that perhaps they might put all the onus on that individual, even though that individual may, as I say, already be in work or may face barriers to work, and that we need to be thinking about the other side of the equation, the support that's offered as well, as we heard earlier in the session previously.
Okay, anyone else?
I think Dr. Webster, you want to come in?
I'd just like to add, we don't really know what job seeker directions are used for. One speculates that they are used for things like telling claimants that they should learn English or that they should smarten themselves up in the way they dress and things like that. But nobody actually knows. There were very, very few job seekers' directions used throughout the history of their existence until the last couple of years when they increased very sharply under the coalition government, but they're still quite a minor element compared to the actively seeking work or equivalent, the claimant commitment.
With the introduction of in-work conditionality, could it be possible that somebody could be sanctioned for not earning enough money, so they're going to lose money because they're not earning enough money? And
if you're not, I've got the figures somewhere, but essentially, if you're not earning the minimum wage, 40 hours a week equivalent, and you're in receipt of in-work benefits, you can be sanctioned as somebody who is working hard in a job because you are not effectively earning enough money and are reliant on in-work welfare support. It can also be subject to a system of fines. Now, whether or not that is actually being applied at the moment, I have my doubts, because as we all know, universal credit is in a rollout phase that's been delayed. But in principle, that is written into the legislation.
But in practice, I've never heard of that.
Well, I don't think we've had a chance to see it in practice yet. Quite frankly, if a government was to put the focus on, I suppose, low-paid, poorer citizens who are doing the best through paid work, and to start sanctioning them or threatening them with fines or requiring them to look for better paid employment, I think it would probably be an error, given the fact that people are doing the best.
Nobody's suggesting that.
Well, that's part of the legislation.
I think that's probably, it hasn't happened yet, but
it's hypothetical.
I'm sorry, it's not hypothetical. It's underpinning universal credit, and it's part and parcel of the proposals that underpin universal credit. So it's not hypothetical. It is not happening yet, and I don't expect it to happen sometime soon.
You used the term so-called advisor.
Sorry, I used the term.
You used the term. You described the Job Centre Plus advisors. You said so-called. so-called advisors. What do you mean by that?
No, it's probably loose use of language, but advisors in Job Centre Plus, a part of the role is to offer support, offer pathways into employment, engage with people perhaps. But at the moment, I think one of the key concerns about the system is that the system seems very much orientated on the sanction side rather than the support side.
Well, we did an investigation into Job Centre Plus, and we didn't come across that at all, and nor do I see that in the 2 Job Centre Pluses that I go to see. The advisors that I meet on a regular basis care passionately trying to help their customers to get into paid work. I'm going to go on to the next question to Dr. Webster. Changes since the 1980s have established a more active employment support system with a stronger link between unemployment benefit and engagement with the labour market, which successive governments have supported, all parties have supported. You believe that active labour market policies would be enhanced by the removal of what you describe as threat and compulsion. What evidence is there to support your view?
Well, there's a lot of evidence from the voluntary sector who produced a lot of reports which have pointed out that inappropriate referrals to projects are much more likely if advisors can simply direct people to do them. That came out particularly strongly in Catherine Hale's report for Mind, which was published in July, which showed that 80 or 90% of the ESA claimants were saying that little or no account had been taken of their needs in referring them to work-related activities. Now, the point about a voluntary system is that you can't refer to something that's too inappropriate because you can't make them do it. So really, it's a fundamental point that the existence of compulsion does make inappropriate referral types of support much more likely. It's worth looking at a historical thing that one of the Unemployment Insurance Acts around about 1920 introduced provision for the first time for compulsion to direct claimants to go on training schemes. That provision wasn't used until about 1930, 1931, and then it was used for 2 years and then dropped. And if you read the Ministry of Labour report of the time, they said basically training schemes are more effective if they're voluntary.
So you don't believe that people should be compulsorily encouraged to go for job applications and job experience, work experience?
I believe that, along with most people who've commented on, well, practically everybody who's commented on this, most people who are unemployed want to work. They want a job. So it is not necessary to run a system on the assumption that most people do not want to work. It doesn't fit the facts. So the basic approach should be to work with the claimant and get them suited. You respect their own strategy for getting work and facilitate them. If they need advice, if they're not pursuing a sensible strategy, and the first recourse should be to give them that advice. Why do you have to have a system which is based on the fundamental assumption that people have to be compelled to do things that they don't want to?
Okay, but if you're in receipt of benefits, then there are taxpayers who work hard and pay taxes, and therefore, if you're in receipt of benefit, then there are rights and responsibilities. And part of the responsibility is that you should, if you are fit for work, you should actively pursue that. What would you say to people who, for example, just as an example of a group of people who work in the black economy, but at the same time claim benefits such as job seekers allowance? Do you not think that they should be perhaps sanctioned?
Well, that's fraud. we have a judicial system which is set up to deal with fraud, and I regularly read cases in the paper where people are being prosecuted for benefit fraud. Why do we need a parallel secret penal system for benefit claimants who are perfectly innocent?
Okay, so Dr. Webster, so you do think that there should be some form of sanctions even if it is prosecution for fraud?
I certainly believe there must be a judicial system which deals with the issue of fraud, absolutely. And I also think that there have to be conditions attached to unemployment benefit. You can't abolish conditions because it's an insurance scheme, and any insurance scheme obviously has conditions. To claim unemployment benefit, you have to be unemployed, which means you have to be available for work, able to work, and looking for work. So these are conditions that you can't get away from. But that's different from, and for most of the existence of unemployment insurance, the conditionality has meant that. It's meant ensuring that people actually meet the conditions for unemployment benefit. But over the last 20 years, we have seen this shift towards running what is in effect a parallel penal system. And I think that we need to ask fundamental questions about whether we need or want a parallel secret penal system alongside the
What do you mean by
judicial
secret penal system?
Well, it's a secret penal system because the decisions are made in secret by officials. The claimant is not present. They're not legally represented. The punishment is applied before there's been any hearing. If they get a hearing, then it's only long after the punishment has been applied. The scale of penalties is more severe than the scale of penalties which is available to the magistrates' courts or sheriff courts in Scotland. So you are talking unmistakably about a penal system which has a set of characteristics which I would suggest are totally unacceptable in a democratic society.
Okay. But these things have happened through all governments. All governments have done that. You fundamentally disagree that there should be any sanctions whatsoever?
No, the penal aspect has crept up really over the last 30 years in a number of incremental changes which I think have never been thought about or discussed as a whole. And the starting point was, in fact, a concept of meeting the conditions, the qualifications for unemployment insurance. So the word that was used was disqualification. It wasn't sanction. And I think we need to stand back and say, and look at the system as a totality that we've now got and say, is this kind of system actually acceptable? Because it's my belief that all the problems that we've been talking about, that were talked about in the previous system, are not an accidental occurrence when you're running a system like this. I think they are an inevitable result of a secret penal system that's grown up without proper safeguards.
Well, I've spoken to people who are advisors, Job Centre Plus advisors, and I've asked them about sanctions. And in my constituency, relatively few sanctions are given out, but I've asked them about the process for giving out sanctions on a case-by-case basis. And I find that the way that they go through it's very professional. It's certainly open, it's not secret, and they do it very reluctantly. But I have to ask you, if you have signed up to look for a job, a 35-hour commitment to look for employment, and there has been a job interview that the individual's failed to attend, they've not gone into the Job Centre Plus as they said they would, and so on and so forth. Do you believe that there should never be a sanction for people who've agreed to go for job interviews, etc., but fail to turn up? Do you believe that should not be sanctioned?
Well, of course, the legal position at the moment is that you cannot be sanctioned for not doing what you've said you'll do. If you challenge a sanction and go to a tribunal, the only matter that the judge will consider is whether you took such steps as were reasonable to help you find employment in your circumstances. And I mean, that's the legal position. What the DWP is doing, actually, is sanctioning people willy-nilly for not doing arbitrarily imposed things. They say to claimants that they've got to apply for 30 jobs in a fortnight, and then they only apply for 29, and they sanction them. I mean, this is completely absurd.
Well, I don't agree with you, Dr. Edson. I have 2 job centre pluses in my constituency, and to describe sanctions being dished out willy-nilly is bizarre and completely ridiculous.
I think Keith wants to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering if I could make a point on your first question on the claimant commitment, because I think that's quite central to how the sanctions regime actually works. We have concerns that people with specific needs and circumstances, that's not identified during the interview in which the claimant commitment is agreed, and then effectively those people are set up to fail because they've signed an agreement that doesn't actually match their needs. And we really need job centres to proactively identify people who have specific needs and make sure that is in the claimant commitment. We've seen people that have very severe literacy problems and that's not part of their claimant agreement and commitment, and they're looking for any type of work. People that have been not able to work for 30 years because of back condition, and again that's not on their claimant commitment, and they're required to take jobs as cleaners. So if the claimant commitment isn't right, and I think in a lot of cases it isn't at the moment, then that is setting people up to fail.
So what you're saying, on a case-by-case basis, the devil is in the detail. You've really got to make sure that the commitment is appropriate to the individual. And
particularly people that have come from IB, ESA, people that have been found fit for work. I think those are the people that are worst affected, that we see it, I believe. And people with mental health conditions that aren't necessarily apparent in the first interview, and then become very apparent when there's a sanction imposed. I think it's paramount that job centres investigate and identify these issues. And we're concerned that claimants feel that they need to sign commitment straight away, that they're not taking it away with them because of that climate of fear that we discussed, that people will just sign things because they're scared that they'll get a sanction if they're not. So it really has to be a constructive interview in the first place.
Chris, you might come in.
Just on this point about disproportionate and apparently punitive sanctions decisions, food banks that we get reports from right across the country give us frequent examples, particularly since the latter part of 2012, of what appear to be very disproportionate decisions. And we see this spread right across the country. We can identify some job centres which seem to be more likely to head that way than others. So there's definitely a lack of consistency of practice. And we do see decisions related to people being only a few minutes late for appointments, people who've been given multiple appointments, one of which has been cancelled, and redress takes too long. And the point that strikes us most powerfully is that many of the clients we help are helped for a short period of time, a few weeks, whilst they're acquiring the redress and the decisions being overturned. So we see the end result, and that reinforces from the food bank and volunteers' perspective the inappropriateness, the unfairness and the punitive nature of the decision, because it was overturned, it just took too long.
Okay, we've got questions on drains and such. Debbie.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I was very interested in terms of what you were saying, Professor Dwyer, in terms of the UC Universal Credit regulations and the in-work conditionality that you mentioned. We included that actually in our report, our JCP report at the beginning of last year. I actually asked the Secretary of State last month whether what conditions there would be for in-work sanctions, and he wasn't able to answer me. And since then, we've obviously had the autumn statement, which shows quite clearly the reduction in tax credits that is being budgeted for. So I think you've hit onto something very important. My question is specifically, will you be monitoring that as part of your work?
One of the groups that we are interviewing is universal credit claimants in 3 locations. We've chosen Inverness, Manchester and Bath, because those are pilot areas.
Yeah.
What's interesting is when we actually, I suppose, put the team together to do this project, which was about 2.5 years ago, these things take time.
Yeah.
Universal credit was an idea. Almost. It was in its infancy, and we've had to add that group of claimants, or what we call welfare service users, to the overall study because of that change. So that in-work conditionality, for want of a better phrase, is something that we will be doing. We're at the very early stages of interviewing those people, because obviously we're doing a lot of interviews.
Thank you. Can I also ask, in terms of, we just mentioned about the claimant commitment, and this is obviously preceding the rollout of UC, which we know has been very, very much delayed and so on, but is there a relationship? Has anybody got evidence of the relationship with the use of the claimant commitment and the increase in sanctioning rates?
I think that the formal introduction of the claimant commitment, which took place between October 2013 and around about April this year, I think that formal introduction doesn't seem to have had any effect on the statistics for sanctions. I would expect that claimants not adhering to their claimant commitment would come under the not actively seeking work category, and that hasn't actually risen.
Okay.
As a result of the claimant commitment being introduced. But in a sense, the government had done this already, because the real increase in sanctions for not actively seeking work came earlier.
Okay. Can I move on then? And while I'm with you, Dr. Webster, if I could ask you in relation to your views about sanctions being applied as a last resort, and I understand that you don't feel that that's the case, and if you'd like to explain a little bit why you don't.
Yes, well, the first thing I would say is that if sanctions were being applied as a last resort, you would expect to find something in the internal staff guidance of the DWP telling staff to apply them as a last resort. There is nothing of the sort in those staff manuals. And if you take as a parallel the procedures that have been introduced for mandatory reconsideration, now there the government certainly wants a situation where going to a tribunal is a last resort, and they have put in any number of steps that have to be followed to make sure that it jolly well is a last resort. So, the claimant the claimant isn't allowed to fill in a form now to trigger a mandatory reconsideration. The form that triggers the mandatory reconsideration is filled in by a DWP official, but only a couple of steps after the claimant has lodged their objection to the sanction. So, the government has designed this process, which is set up to ensure that a tribunal hearing will be a last resort. But in the case of sanctions, there's nothing like that. If you look at the manuals, they just say, the claimant is sanctionable if they do X, Y, Z.
Just in relation to sanctions and whether they're a last resort or not, I think two things are important. I take the gentleman's point that some frontline providers, front of desk support staff, work proactively to support people.
Yes.
But other people certainly report that in their interactions with particular members of staff in particular places, that decisions to sanction are taken and not clearly explained. So the issue of discretion of what's called street level bureaucrats is vital. The other side of it, I think, that's important, that seems to be increasingly part of the system, is the application of an almost automatic sanction. So the lack of discretion. So the situation where somebody turns up a few minutes late and pleads the case, but they're told, no, you're late, there's a sanction, etc. So there's this issue of discretion of individual people administering and implementing policy, but there's also the increasing automation almost of sanction, which is something that a colleague at York, looking at the work programme, as mentioned in discussions around these issues.
While I'm with you, Professor Dwyer, I mean, there has been some comments by former JCP advisors in terms of the inappropriateness of sanctions, and that they, I think Keith mentioned some claimants being set up to fail because of a sort of targeted approach around sanctions. Again, will you be looking at this in your work?
We are looking. Well, essentially, what we tried to do is explore if people were sanctioned, why they were sanctioned, and the impact of that. Yeah, but the other side of it as well, which I'm keen to emphasise, is we do see welfare conditionality as sanction and support. Yeah. One of the key things at the moment, I think, is that the support side, as I started by saying, has been almost relegated as secondary, and it's vital if the system is going to enable people into fulfilling work, sustainable work, etc.
Thank you. Dr. Webster.
Before you go on to your next question, I'm going to bring Paul in.
Professor Dwyer, just on the issue of discretion in particular, isn't there a moral dilemma here? Because the more you try to make the system more transparent and rigorous and rules-based, so people are clear over what triggers a sanction and what doesn't, aren't you then diminishing the amount of discretion that the frontline member of staff can actually exercise, because they have to stick within ever more rigid guidelines? Do you see that tension? How might we resolve that?
There certainly is a tension. I mean, and the tension, I suppose, cuts to the heart of the personalisation agenda, because the government is committed to the extension of conditionality, its intensification, but also, importantly, they say it's personalisation. Now, that must mean some element of discretion from providers who are offering support to people that takes into account the multiple needs of certain vulnerable groups, particularly, as has been mentioned. There is a tension, and I don't think that's been resolved. It appears at the moment, and this is my personal opinion, not based on evidence from the study. One thing I want to say is our study's ongoing, so it's too early to say definitive statements, but it appears to me that the sanction aspect of it is to the fore and is being foregrounded maybe as a deterrent to worklessness, and the support side is being lost perhaps.
And to horrify Dr. Webster, who I actually find a degree of common ground with, I'm sorry to tell you that, would you therefore not agree that perhaps over the past 40 to 50 years, the development of conditionality and sanctions regimes have become an end in themselves, rather than related to actual work outcomes, that we develop a policy of conditionality based upon implementing a policy of conditionality with a sanctions regime that then follows it? That's become almost a parallel policy sphere, away from actually linking it to how does it deliver a job outcome.
I would agree, and the thing that is interesting to me as someone who started looking at this as a PhD student 20 years ago is the way that points of principle have almost been lost from the debate. There is a mainstream consensus that conditionality, i.e. sanction, with an emphasis on sanction and a work-first approach, is the way forward. That's quite a recent development. I mean, I remember writing my PhD in 1994, reading a Labour Party document, for example, that said we will not use the blunt Tory tool of compulsion. Yet within 2 years, there'd been a switch and an acceptance of a principle of conditionality, of using sanction, primarily sanction, as a lever to change the behaviour of claimants. And I think we need to unpick and understand that and see whether that's reasonable, whether it's ethical, justified, and that's one of the things we're trying to do at the moment.
Webster, well, if I could mention some figures first of all. In terms of the money withheld as a result of sanctions for JSA claimants, we know that in 2009-10 this was 11 million. Between April and October 2012, this rose to 60 million. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to access data from Department for Work and Pensions of the money withheld for JSA sanctions since the new sanction regime has been set up in October 2012. I understand that you've estimated that this is £300 million. Could you just clarify that position, please?
Yes, actually 275 I think is what I'm saying. That is on the assumption that people wouldn't have left JSA.
So that's a 25 times increase since 2009-10.
No, it's actually less than that, because the figure that you quoted for 2009-10 is only the amount withheld from what were then fixed length sanctions, because the DWP was saying, well, we can't give you an estimate for the variable length sanctions because we don't know how long they were. Okay. So I produced an estimate of those, and my estimate was about 50 million for that time. For the overall cost of amount withheld from the whole sanction system was about 50 million. So it's now gone up to about 275 million. Now, you'd have to adjust that figure for the factors that what the DWP is now saying is that we can't do an estimate because we don't know what claimants would have done if they hadn't been sanctioned. But if we set that as, so
you make assumptions. I'm a former academic. You do exactly.
But it's that sort of money.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful indeed. And my final question to Professor Dwyer. I mean, we talked in the previous panel about initial work that's been undertaken by a research group at the University of Oxford, which has looked at 370 local authority areas and has estimated that 1 in 4 JSA claimants that are sanctioned leave JSA, they go off flow, and that more than half of those do so for reasons other than employment. How would you be investigating what happens to those claimants?
I mean, the first thing is to say about that, even the most sort of enthusiastic advocates of welfare conditionality, people like Lawrence Mead in America, accept that although you might reduce the numbers on benefit, the outcomes are very varied and people often disengage. That's accepted. The way we're trying to investigate that is by interviewing 480 people 3 times over a 2-year period. So where people have been sanctioned, some of them may well walk away, and we're into their lived experience of sanctions and support, and the role that sanction might have played in them disengaging with the system, or more positively, the way in which, for some people, sanction or support may actually have promoted engagement. It's not just a one-way street.
I appreciate that.
Again, from some of the interviews we've done, without preempting them, I can think of situations and interviews, having spoken with colleagues, where people have received support and it's working for them at the time of first interview, and we interview them over a 2-year period to see if anything changes in that period, and if so, the role of sanction and support.
I think the qualitative evidence is
it's very
really
much
important. Does anybody want to add to that?
Thank you. We surveyed 55 CAB advisors, welfare advisors in the front line last year on the sanctions, and we found that the vast majority disagreed that sanctions help clients find employment, but 84% felt that sanctions actually push people off the benefit and actively discourage people from claiming it in the first place because they've had previous experience, or their neighbours or friends have claimed in the past and had problems. I think in the last session it was mentioned that there's a gap between the unemployment rate and the claimant rate now, and that's been growing since the sanctions regime was amended in 2012, and I think it's half of people unemployed claim JSA now, and that's historically low. So statistics show there is a gap. And at least half the people who are unemployed aren't getting support, or financially or employment support. So I think there is definitely a case that people are being pushed off the benefit, not necessarily into work.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay. Questions from Mike?
This is Chris Moore. Hi, thanks. Now, I believe that your data on food bank use indicates that about 30% of cases are delayed from sanctions. Another 15% are due to benefit changes, and so on. did you have a category, or did you put benefit sanctions into any of that? I mean, have you got any figures on what would be on the benefit sanctions?
No, we haven't got any clear figures on sanctions specifically. Our data is collected from a referral voucher, which is completed by a care professional. We've got over 30,000 agencies in the country that hold Trussell Trust food bank vouchers, and they sign and verify that, to the best of their knowledge, the reason for someone needing help is valid. And 30% of the people who need help, the primary cause of that is categorised as benefit delay, and that generally doesn't get used by the professional who's filling the voucher out for to do with the sanction. Benefit change is usually the category that's used. That's 15%. So overall, 45% of some 913,000 people who received emergency food support last year were there because of a problem, a primary problem, with the receipt of social security support. Either it was delayed, or there'd been a change in the level, or there'd been a sanction. And we can't separate it out without changing our vouchers, changing our data system. The strength is that we've got a historic statistical run way back to 2000. The weakness is that we've not adjusted it to get more targeted. We've surveyed our food banks and do quite regularly to find out more about their experience. And 86% of our respondents, last time we asked them about sanctions, which was recent in November, told us that they had seen an increase, a significant increase. So that in the number of people coming to food banks, for the primary reason being that they received a sanction. Now that's self-reporting in the sense that it's the care professional or the individual, so they may not be using the word sanction always.
I think that's what we heard earlier, wasn't it? That people who have their benefit change, a decrease for any reason or whatever, often just use the word sanction. And so, I mean, you're incredibly knowledgeable about all of this. So, would you personally like to throw in any kind of idea of what you think might be the percentage based on sanctions? Would you be willing to have a guess in public on television, knowing that we wouldn't have a go at you if you're wrong?
No, I wouldn't guess. But I would for sure say that there has been a significant change in the frontline experience since the latter part of 2012. So our volunteers and our food banks have been reporting with increasing distress and increasing anger the numbers of clients who come to them who have had a catastrophic collapse in their income as a result of a decision by someone in Job Centre Plus. And they see the consequences, and this is the point. I mean, whether the decision's valid or not, there's a consequence. The consequence is not just for the individual, but the family. We see, parents in tears with children with them, not knowing how they've got into the situation they've got into, not understanding the communications that they've received. They can't. The volunteers in the food bank find difficulty interpreting the letters too, and so on and so forth. And many of these things are rectifiable. And this is why we're trying to get more welfare rights advice into food banks, because things can be put right quickly by people who understand, who know who to phone, and who know the language.
All of us around this table have that experience on a weekly basis, I think.
Can I just ask, Citizen Advice Scotland, have you've done some research on this? Have you got an estimate of what proportion of people who are accessing food banks are as a result of benefit sanction rather than just benefit change?
We've done some research on the cases that we get in. They aren't necessarily valid by the sort of the standards of universities, but we say it's the second most common reason for referring on after benefit delays, and certainly I wouldn't put a figure on it again, but certainly the third is nowhere near. So it's definitely benefit delays and sanctions which are the two drivers. And we find that roughly about 1 in 42 clients that come into Citizens Advice Bureau are being referred to food parcels now. And for unemployed clients, it's about 1 in 11. that come through the door. So the number is definitely increasing. I wouldn't want to put a proportion on it.
I can give you some figures. It's from our emergency use only report, which was done jointly with Oxfam and other bodies. The range is between 19% and 28% of a selected number of food banks. The proportion of people who were in the food bank as a consequence of a sanction. And that tells you something about the differential application. Tower Hamlets was one of those at the bottom end of that range. Durham was at the top end. But that's just a small sample. Properly looked at, so it's academically valid, it's statistically valid, but it doesn't tell you about 430 food banks and over 1,000 locations.
I mean, the difficulty is that if we're really trying to find out how many food bank visits are caused by sanctions, and with your organisation, which is the biggest one in the country, the statistics from you would be really useful to try and find out what's actually going on, and that we can't really tell, and we can't really tell from this anecdotal data, can we?
We plan to change and develop the data system. There is an important point that we have to make as a caveat. The voucher is completed by a care professional and the claimant, and it is self-reporting. Exactly. It is what they say is the primary cause of their problem with income. And we're not going to be resourcing ourselves to check that. We do believe that there should be a change in the way that the system is administered by the DWP, so that there is an assumption, a presumption, that the customer and the claimant is someone who is worthy of respect, and therefore when they say something has happened to them, or they should be believed. So that we think the Jobs Centre Plus should do more checking of data. We'd be very happy to participate in the sharing of research, the exploration of the validity of this information. We can't afford to fund the research.
I mean, your primary aim is to help people who need help, not to provide us with statistics. I totally understand that, and it's absolutely right. Just to move on a little bit, you did a recent report jointly with CPAG, and that you found around 30% of food was results. We already just talked about that. But yeah, okay. So we'll just move on.
I was just going to say, if Nikki have you got any statistics at all?
The discretionary scheme for Blackpool Council will definitely have some statistics on it, but it would be very small, and it certainly, it would show a Blackpool bias, I think, as to, to our deprivation rates and everything. So it certainly wouldn't be that useful in this arena, but they certainly could provide them.
It would be useful.
I think Debbie was trying to get in.
I think there was, again, the Oxford group and collaborating with the University of Liverpool have done some international and local stuff. Again, the 346 local authority areas that has linked sanctions directly with increased food bank use. So there is evidence there, and it was presented at the World Public Health Nutrition Conference last year. So,
okay, on to Nigel.
I guess if the system provides one alternative to resulting to a food bank, it's a hardship payment. Have you seen any increasing awareness of hardship payments following the Oakley review recommending that they become somewhat more widely publicised? Perhaps Nikki or Chris?
No.
Not yet. What we have seen over the last year is a surprising and distressing number of people who weren't aware of the local welfare assistance scheme that they could have been helped by, or the hardship payment that they should have been told about. But I think there is a fundamental point. For most people who are sanctioned, the hardship payment is not available for at least 2 weeks. And it's very difficult to feed yourself and your family with no money over that 2-week period.
Sorry, if Keith going to come in.
Just to support that point, when we surveyed our advisors, 92% said that the process of appeals and hardship payments was not clearly explained to claimants by the Jobs Centre.
Just keep talking, it's all right.
And that was June last year, and I don't think we've seen much improvement. I saw a case last week of a single father of 3 children that had survived for 5 weeks of a sanction without knowing that he could apply for hardship payment. So I do think that hardship payment should be automatic when there's children involved, especially. It shouldn't be up to the claimant to find out and then apply. They should apply automatically, I think.
Would such a change?
Just in terms of Blackpool, do you find that the local job centre plus makes people who are being sanctioned aware that the hardship fund exists? Or do you still get people coming to you unaware?
No, we do still get people coming to us, so they're not necessarily aware. So that is certainly our biggest problem is that our job centre is that we are quite unique how we work, which is why I'm here, I think, because we are quite unique. And that we are working with the discretionary scheme. So the discretionary scheme does the assessments, and then we have a whole range of agencies like housing, probation, etc. that actually provides the service, and it's always looking at the underlying issues. And as part of that, we look at the conditions. As part of that, we do give conditions to people that they need to fulfil. And that we then manage the resources. So it's quite unusual, the service that we offer, but it is all about working together. And we've got a range of agencies in Blackpool that are really trying to work together, and we really need the DWP to be part of that process, to work with us. And we do put conditions in place already. So, for example, if someone's going for getting a food parcel from the discretionary scheme and they've got debt problems, we do ask them to look at going to the credit union, and then if they go back for another food parcel and they haven't been to the credit union, then we'll say, well, no, you need to go to the credit union to get that sorted before you get your food parcel, and we'll even take the food parcel to the credit union. So there is that conditions that go with it. So we're not adverse to kind of conditions being put in place, but we want the DWP to work with us, because all the agencies are trying to work together.
Can I ask, is there a particular problem with the fact that as the money is stopped immediately, the personal advisor says you're going to be sanctioned before it's gone to review, and the review is maybe reinstated? Is that causing particular problems? Just the way the system works?
I don't think there are too many systems where people are presumed guilty, because if most people, if the advisor suspects that they haven't followed the job direction or not followed their claimant commitment, and their money stopped immediately. And while if your sanction is reversed, you get the money back, you still have gone days or probably weeks without the income that you're entitled to.
That is exactly what the food banks experience, and obviously we're aware that we are the emergency resource, and so we are going to get a skewed picture. We're going to get to see people who have had a catastrophic drop in their income and are have nowhere else to turn. What disturbs the people who've worked in food banks for many years is the fact that it takes longer than ever before to get a decision dealt with and overturned. We've always been around to help people who've made a mistake and have consequently faced the consequences. And the local community is happy to give them food. What we find very difficult is to give food to people for longer periods of time who needn't have been there in the first place because the decision that got them there was a wrong decision. And we see 9 weeks, months, sometimes several months, 3 months before a decision gets overturned and things put right.
And if I could just add to that again, it's about going back to the fact that the financial condition should be a last resort. It's about actually providing other kind of conditions first, using that sort of thing.
Just on that point, one interview I conducted with a person who works in benefit advice in the north of England was very clear that the way the system is set up now, although you can appeal, it's, as mentioned before by Dr. Webster, that's actually becoming a barrier to people accessing support in many ways, because often it can be 2 or 3 weeks before even the person advising them understands why they were sanctioned, and by the time they get to that first step or they start the process, the sanction's finished and the person goes, right, forget it. So you get a sort of unvirtuous.
Have you got data about how many people are giving up the process in that way before they actually get a resolution? Do you know?
I've not got an estimate on it, but the gentleman I interviewed said it was a serious and recurrent problem with the benefit advice centres he worked above and advised.
Just on that issue of appeals, I wonder whether Nikki and Chris have observed any pattern in terms of people who have been sanctioned arriving for support who aren't actually appealing the sanction. We've been trying to drill down today to how particularly vulnerable groups are being dealt with in the system. And one hypothesis is that the problem is everyone is equally liable to be sanctioned, but there are certain vulnerable groups who are least likely to appeal and go through the process of appeal, partly because of the time, partly because of the complexity. Do you observe anything at sort of individual food bank level in terms of how willing people are to appeal and whether certain groups are less likely to appeal than not appeal?
Yes, I mean, we use the third sector as advocates quite a lot for people. So we actively encourage them to be advocates for people because people with learning difficulties, particularly mild learning difficulties, seem to kind of fall through the net, and people with mental health problems as well, and people with multiple and complex problems are definitely, it's just all too much for them. So unless they have an advocate to work with them, and often, you know, they don't necessarily use the resources, but certainly our soup kitchens are quite hot on trying to help them, but they do, because they can't manage the process.
We've run a system and still do which provides a minimum of 3 days of emergency food assistance. It's nutritionally balanced food, and there is a limit to it, 3 vouchers in a 6-month period, and that is because we want to help people to back into the support systems that exist. And yes, we've seen a trend towards people feeling more reluctant to turn. We had discussion in the first session about the loss of the focus on employment support. People do fear the statutory service that's meant to help them. They do have a start point presumption that actually the people who are making these decisions don't have their welfare and their interests at heart. And we found that where we've put advisors into food banks, and that's just in a number of different parts of the country, who can access a food bank clients right at the point when they're getting emergency food and look at their situation, you get better results in terms of resolution of the underlying problem. I quoted Tower Hamlets earlier as one of the places where the number of people who were referred with sanctions was low. That's also a food bank where we have welfare rights advisors placed in the centre, and we get much better collaboration between the local authority, the housing advice, the welfare assistance scheme, than in places where that doesn't happen.
And in your evidence, you have a long list of examples of where I would consider the food bank user had a good reason not to be sanctioned.
Yes.
A good example in Farnworth being the gentleman who had a learning disability, where the advisor wrote down the dates in non-chronological order. That would be obviously good reason in my view. Are you seeing a pattern whereby clients who do have good reason and who would therefore have a case to appeal, not appealing, and therefore that would then strengthen the argument that the Job Centre Plus needs to extract the good reason from the customer rather than vice versa?
I can't say we've seen a pattern because we haven't got the sort of statistical comparators there. But anecdotally, we have what we see is a growing sense amongst clients that it's a little bit hopeless. That this is to do with the sense of the punitive nature of the system and its administration. Something has changed in the last couple of years in the culture. But this is an anecdotal thing which we collect from meeting clients, meeting volunteers, listening to our food banks, and we spread right across the country. And I guess the only reason I'd say the anecdotal approach has validity is that we also get stories of good practice. So we can say it's possible to do better because in this town or that they do better.
Just one more, and I promise to shut up. Just another vulnerable group that we haven't really covered much today, I don't think, are the homeless, which of course we have an immense homelessness problem in Blackpool.
Yeah.
We just wanted to focus, Nikki, on that particular group. Do you think the current system works for them of relying upon mail communication through the post when they don't necessarily have a long-term address?
No, it doesn't work. And again, it's very much, we get into contact with them via advocates. Mm-hmm. So, again, a lot of the work is advocates ringing on their behalf. So that's where they're at a soup kitchen and the soup kitchen contacts us to say this person isn't managing the benefit system and, then we're linking them in with the discretionary scheme and the mental health crisis team or whatever else.
So would it be accurate to say that for the most vulnerable, i.e. those with high levels of transient mental health problems, homelessness, actually they need an individual advocate to go with them through the system to actually navigate it successfully or to have any hope of getting what they're entitled
and also to link up with the other services that are around them, So for example, we had, as an example, we had a person at one of our distribution points who turned up suicidal, and this was on Monday. And when he turned up, we were able to connect him. He wasn't very communicative, but we managed to get his mental health crisis nurse contact details. So they were then part of the process that linked up with the discretionary scheme, with looking at what was going to happen next in terms of food parcels, advice and support, etc. Because there's often a range of professionals that are around a person, so it's getting some, not just an advocate, but also getting those range of professionals talking, and that's where we want the DWP, with those range of professionals talking, and Blackpool, Tower Hamlets, we're pretty similar, is an ideal place to kind of do a pilot, because we're a unitary authority, we're quite small, to support those people, to look at really how we can support people from very particular vulnerable groups to work with the DWP and other people. And
very quickly, are you aware of what occurs in Westminster, where I understand from CSAM's evidence that the Westminster Job Centre Plus funds the Cardinal Hume Centre to work with these very groups of people to get a targeted outcome? Do you not?
That would really.
Are you surprised that isn't more widely known? That Job Centre Pluses do that in some places?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a real shock to us because we have no communication with the DWP. Really, it's very, very difficult, and it would be so supportive for us to be able to be working with them. And just in terms of the funds as well, I mean, we're at risk. We're at risk of not having the funds next year, and we're all working together. So. It would be ideal.
Just on homeless people, a previous study that I did a couple of years ago in Nottingham and London, where we compared the sort of priorities of service providers and users, clients. It was interesting that many, we were looking at people with complex needs, what we call multiply excluded homeless people, drug and drink issues, maybe abuse in childhood, etc., etc. And the thing that came out of that study was that where there were conditions applied and sanctions and sticks were used, people just walked away. They literally disengaged. And what made the difference for people changing the behaviour was where support workers, usually an individual or a service, went to them and went the extra mile without saying, in order to get this, you must do that. Because people often who are excluded like that have had that all their lives, and that is what forces them away. So unconditional help, or help on their terms, personalised support, which can get around some of the sort of structural barriers, the conditions that are often placed upon them, works well for some.
Sheila, really quickly, and then
exactly when the lack of income kicks in, because it did come up in the Oakley review, but this seems quite a complex system. People can lose their benefit, and maybe Keith could answer this from the sort of CAB point of view. People appear to be able to lose their benefit when they're referred for a sanction, even if the actual decision to sanction hasn't been made, Then you've got the sanction and people losing the money. Then you've got the appeal system. So there's a lot of points at which the money is lost. But do you get people coming who've lost income at the referral point rather than the decision point?
Yeah, plenty of claimants that come in and they don't know why they have money, and we have to find out that they actually have been sanctioned. Sometimes the DWP is not clear if it's sanction or suspension. And
could you clarify the difference between, as you understand it, between a suspension and a sanction?
Think it's very complex, and I don't think DWP staff always understand it either. And it's very important actually, and claimants don't understand it. Obviously, they think they have been sanctioned, but actually their claim's been closed in a lot of cases, which then does have an impact on housing benefit and council tax benefit and so on. But I think it's fair to say that it is stopped at unexpected moments. I think that part of the review was that claimants need to be told before it's stopped, but we still see claimants who have their income stopped without knowing why, and they have no sort of leeway to plan to actually say, well, okay, I'll keep a bit of money aside. It's often stopped just before their payment date. So they're expecting a payment and it's not there, and then that's the first they know about it. So that still happens, and there's no way for the person to plan to actually cope with the break in income.
Yeah, I can explain the theory behind the concept of suspension. It goes back to this distinction between qualification for the insurance benefit, meeting the conditions, and the idea of sanction as a punishment. Suspension occurs when a doubt is raised about whether the person is qualified to receive the benefit, because the DWP argues we shouldn't be paying out money to people who may not have an entitlement, because then that's creating a repayment problem. So it's seen as a different issue from actually applying a sanction, which they don't do till there's an actual decision. However, the waters have been considerably muddied because as a result of the Oakley review, the DWP have now said that they're not going to suspend benefit before a decision in the case of not actively seeking work, which is the most common type of sanction. Now, whether they've implemented that yet or not, I don't know. Of course, again, there is a bit of a logic to that, because the whole concept of not actively seeking work has been tremendously stretched under the present coalition. I mean, in terms of the Job Seekers Act 1995, actively seeking work is taking such steps as are reasonable in your circumstances to give you the best prospect of employment. And then we've had lots of arbitrary requirements imposed on top of that, which then have been treated as if they, not meeting them, disqualifies people from getting any benefit at all. You see what I mean? The concept of, you know, as I said, it's to be unemployed, you have to be looking for work. The ILO accepts you're not unemployed if you're not seeking work. But what's happened is that concept has been stretched and stretched, so that you're being told you're not actively seeking work if you're not meeting these very arbitrary requirements, like the 35 hours a week, or the 30 jobs a fortnight, or whatever. So, because the DWP has stretched this concept so much, it has in fact undermined the logic of suspension, which is essentially tied up with the concept of disqualification. Because really they've turned what is a qualification to be considered as unemployed, namely actively seeking work, into a sanction, effectively. So they should treat it the same administratively as a sanction.
I'm just moving on because we have it way over time, but Anne-Marie has got some final questions.
Right, I'll make it quick. Does conditionality work? One of the things, Professor Dwyer, that you say policymakers' assumptions about conditionality and its effects remain largely untested. How would you test?
Well, the way we're hoping to explore it, I don't use the word test because people are complex beings, it's not what we're doing, but the way we're going to explore it is by looking at the effects on individuals' lives, those who experience conditionality in its various forms, in various arenas, and whether how it might change lives, how it might trigger changes in behaviour or not. And we're going to explore that through a large qualitative study with 480 people interviewed 3 times, essentially.
And how are you going to unpick, if you like, the cause and the effect? Is the consequence of the sanction that they obey the rules, because that's one outcome, or is it that they get into work, and to the extent that you try to differentiate your answer, are they actually impacted by the extent of employment support they got? Because it's quite a knotty problem to try and unpick cause and effect.
It's a very knotty problem, and I don't know whether qualitative research can do cause and effect in that precise way. But what it can do is look at people in the sort of round of their lives. So it can look at other factors. It doesn't just look perhaps at the welfare system, but also other forms of support, social networks that may or may not be available to them, issues of impairment, issues of education, ability, etc., relationship breakdown, and find out how that mediates the ability to work, and it's messy, and at the moment I could say we can't provide any answers, but hopefully in 4 years' time we'll be getting there.
Okay. A bit late for us.
Sorry?
I said a bit late for us.
I'm sorry
we've got 2 months.
Is there any evidence that by increasing the length or ferocity of the sanction, that has a greater deterrent effect? Because I think in 2012 the rules were changed, and I wonder if there's any evidence as to whether that change, one, has been used, and 2, whether it's actually been it's made a difference.
I'm not qualified to answer that properly, but my suspicion is the intensification of sanction, a longer period, which came in, repeat sanction, etc., will not drive people into work. It will drive them further away from both work and collective welfare systems.
Chris?
Very quick point. From our point of view within the food bank, the intensity, the increased duration of the sanction has driven lots more people to the food bank and created much more complex problems in their lives, which make, we would assume, it more difficult to put things right and get a job. We see people who've got serious health issues, which are a direct result of not being able to feed themselves properly, desperate anxiety. We talk to local general practitioners who are at their wits' end about what to do, and so all we can do is prescribe medication that we shouldn't be prescribing for people who've been driven to this situation because the sanction appears to be punitive and is running for so long. So, you know, it has consequences, and the consequences are that people end up without food.
And then finally, Professor Dwyer, this one's for you. Is there any international experience in other countries of a different system which perhaps looks at a more balanced approach of carrot and stick? So could you put in place something which is more of a carrot if you are actually complying with whatever it is that's being asked of you, as opposed to, or maybe sort of juxtapositioned with a sanctioned model, which is the one that we have?
I mean, that's interesting. Several years ago, the DWP used a sort of carrot and stick approach in relation to JSA and issues of adult literacy and numeracy. So they said to some people in certain areas, you must engage in an adult literacy course, a numeracy course. If you don't, we're going to cut your benefit. If you don't attend, it'll have serious consequences, etc. It's a requirement. With another group in England, they actually said in a different area, if you come and engage with this, we will enhance your benefit by 15 quid, I think it was. We will provide a bonus payment at the end. Now, what was interesting at the time, around 2005, when I was delving into that, I never got to what happened, yeah? So these experiments have been sort of tried, but the outcomes I could never get into. It does beg the question of principle again, though, which is where I started, about whether using sanction is appropriate in certain situations, like, for example, trying to improve the literacy and therefore the job prospects of certain individuals. And my personal opinion is it's not the way forward.
Okay, yeah, any final comments? Otherwise, this is probably the final question.
Mine would just be that individuals, that if there's an individually tailored programme which the agencies all work together to help support an individual, then in that sense, if there's some conditions as part of that, then that might be a really positive way forward, because it's looking at the person as a whole, not just the job side of things. So.
Ours is really simple. We would urge government, I guess, to try to take an impact assessment that goes beyond the narrowness of work and pensions and its budget. The consequence of a policy which has changed and is being applied in a way that's different from the way it was done before. What impact has that had on health and its budgets? What impact has it had on local authorities and their capacity to cope with vulnerable people and support them? And then we think that there would be some changes in decision making as a consequence of that bigger picture being taken.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, this is I support the committee's call for a fundamental review of the sanctions regime. I think we're working in a bit of a vacuum here in that we don't really know if there's a causal relationship between employment and sanctions, and we're mixing up the means and the ends, I think. I also really concerned that we talk about destitution now. That was a word we never ever used in public policy in the UK for years, and yet there are academic studies that are looking at whether destitution exists in the UK, and they're finding that it does. And I think sanctions fit into that. So I think that claimants should never be left without an income. And that the support should be there. I recognise that conditionality needs to be there, but we can't be putting people into destitution and pushing them away from employment.
And from what you're saying, it's very similar to the first panel this morning, is that if the sanctions are inappropriate or overly harsh, you end up driving people away from the support that's meant to help them rather than towards it. And you're all nodding, so I'm assuming that's okay. Well, can I thank you very much for coming along this morning? We really appreciate it. This will help us greatly when we come to write a report. So can I thank you again? Order, order.
The Grimmond Room.